everybody. I'm excited for the opportunity to share with you guys tonight what God has laid on my heart. It's funny because as I was preparing for this sermon a few weeks ago, I found myself praying to God desperately every day. God, reveal to me what it is that you want me to talk about tonight. Show me specifically what topic you want me to speak on. And I didn't really feel like I was hearing anything, and I was just kind of a few days went by, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm gonna preach on in a few weeks in class. But ironically enough, one morning after the shower, and I was praying the same thing, and it was as if God kind of slapped me across the face and was like, hey, Bailey, you are desperately asking me to speak to you clearly. Why don't you speak on discerning my voice and how I speak to people? So from that point forward, I kind of knew what I was going to talk about. But I wanted to start off by sharing a story that I heard many times growing up in my youth, and just on Wednesday nights, and it's something that I've carried with me through my faith journey. Some of you may have heard it before. It's called I Sent You a Rowboat, and it goes like this. Is that a yes? Yeah, everyone's heard it? Okay. A very religious man was once caught in rising floodwaters. He climbed onto the roof of his house and trusted God to rescue him. A neighbor came by in a canoe and said, "The waters will soon be above your house. Hop in and we'll paddle to safety." "No thanks," replied the religious man. "I've prayed to God and I'm sure he will save me." A short time later, the police came by in a boat. "The waters will soon be above your house. Hop in and we'll take you to safety." "No thanks," replied the religious man. "I've prayed to God and I'm sure he will save me." A little time later, a rescue services helicopter hovered overhead, let down a rope ladder, and said, "The waters will soon be above your house. Climb the ladder and we'll fly you to safety." "No thanks," replied the religious man. "I prayed to God and I'm sure he will save me." All this time, the floodwaters continued to rise until soon they reached above the roof and the religious man drowned. When he arrived in heaven, he demanded an audience with God. Ushered into God's throne room, he said, "Lord, why am I here in heaven? I prayed for you to save me. I trusted you to save me from that flood." "Yes, you did, my child," replied the Lord, "and I sent you a canoe, a boat, and a helicopter, but you never got it." So as silly and childish as that story may seem, don't many of us relate to that religious man when it comes to hearing God's voice and discerning his voice and listening to his voice? Because we don't frequently hear God audibly, it's easy for us to ask if God does still speak. Or we say we believe God still speaks to us today, but we look and listen for him in all the wrong places. As a result, we miss what he has to say and how he is providing for us and leading us. Sometimes he speaks clearly. Most often he does not speak audibly, although I believe he could if he chose to. Sometimes his voice is more difficult to discern, but he does speak to each of us uniquely and individually according to who we are and who he created us to be. So how do we know he's speaking to us? How can we discern whether it's God or just our own thoughts? I believe that God does still speak, and I want to explore 3 different action steps that will better enable us to listen, discern, and hear him. The first of these being through prayer. Now, I'm not just talking about sitting down, having your quiet time, talking to God, saying amen, and going about the rest of your day. I'm talking about listening. And we often forget that listening is an essential part of communication. So if prayer is our communication with God, instead of making it all about ourselves and talking at God, we need to give God a chance to talk and respond in our prayer life. To deny God the opportunity of speaking to our lives and respond is to deny God. Speaking without listening is a prideful way of showing that we aren't dependent on him and that we can't handle it on our own. If we don't give God an opportunity to speak, how can we expect to hear from him? And we even find the importance of listening to God in Jesus' ministry and his time on earth. Many times Jesus escaped to pray in solitude, and while there's no specific reference of Jesus listening to God speak, the amount of time that Jesus spent alone with God in prayer implies that he conversated with God, and if a conversation is talking and listening, I believe that Jesus was listening to God. In Matthew 14:23, Jesus goes up on the mountain after dismissing the crowds by himself to pray and does not come down until evening. In Matthew 26, Jesus prays in Gethsemane 3 times alone, asking the Father to take this cup of death from him, but ultimately waiting, listening, and expectant for God's ultimate will to be done. Luke 6:12 references Jesus going to the mountain to pray and continuing to pray to God all night. So we see that listening in prayer is one way to seek God's voice and possibly hear it. We even see the importance of that lived out in Jesus' earthly life and ministry. A second way that we can actively seek God's voice and learn to hear and discern his voice is by practicing connecting with him. And what I mean by that is that each of us feels closest and connected to God in different ways, and ways that are personal to us and personal to our relationship with him. And in those different ways, he speaks to us and speaks through us. For me, it's writing and journaling. I feel closest to God when I am writing, but I also feel that God speaks most clearly to me as I'm writing as well. And I also feel that he speaks most clearly through me, that I'm able to better communicate with words on a page than words spoken verbally. Many of us have those different things. You all connect to God differently in some way. That's personal to you. This may come through time spent alone, time spent in prayer, could be writing, maybe worship, time spent in nature. It's different for all of us, but discovering how you connect best with God can enable you to more clearly hear from him in those moments that you spend in those times that are specific to you. So nature, worship, as I said, which also enables a closer relationship with God, just how it is so unique to you. From the previous scriptures that we talked about in the first point, it's evident that when Jesus goes away to speak and hear from God, he always does so alone. Mark 1:35 says that Jesus went to a desolate place to pray early in the morning while it was still dark. Jesus connected best with God when he could be alone with him. Because Jesus knew this, he made sure to find a way to be alone with God frequently and discovered God's presence best in those times alone with him. It enabled him to hear God more clearly and connect with him, which is something that we all crave, relationship and time with God. That time and relationship may look different for all of us. It's personal, as we said, but God meets us in those places because it makes our relationship with him unique according to how he uniquely created us. And a final way to better discern the voice of God is to surround ourselves with people that God can use to speak his truth through to us. Like prophets, God can speak through others to speak to us, and sometimes God can reach us that way. That is how God can best communicate to us and best reach us, because he uses people that we trust to speak to us. So he's able to connect with us in that way. Moses is an example of this. Many of you know the life of Moses, and God spoke to Moses frequently. And Moses was someone that the Israelites trusted. Because God spoke to Moses frequently and the Israelites trusted him, Moses was able to lead and speak truth over the Israelites, and they believed him and they followed him. In Exodus 3, when God calls Moses to lead a rescue of the Israelites out of Egypt, God tells Moses that his people, referring to the Israelite elders, will listen to what Moses says to them. Exodus 3 marks the beginning of Moses' call as the one who will mediate between the Lord and his people. So God used Moses to speak to the Israelites and surround the Israelites with a person, with a voice that they would listen to and could trust and could follow, because God was with Moses and he spoke his words and truths directly to him and through him. I want to close by reading Romans 8:26-27, which says, "Likewise the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God." When we become a Christian, the Holy Spirit dwells within us, which gives us a God-given ability to hear what the Father is saying. So hearing from God is something that's sacred, and a lot of times we don't treat it as that way, but entering into the presence of God, having the opportunity to hear from God, is something that is so sacred, and we need to trust God's voice in our life and trust the timing of his voice in our life. God does not have to speak to us, but he chooses to speak to us. So we should be doing everything that we can to listen to him and discern his voice and obey what we are hearing. So how can we begin to do that? Discovering his voice and how he speaks individually to us by prayer, practice, and people.